All right, Mr. Jonas Tyroller, how have you been since Thronefall released?
Oh, I've been amazing. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm super excited to be here, and I hope I'm not the next episode right after Jonathan Blow, because that would significantly increase my performance anxiety.
Well, I will tell you, dude. Do you know who you're coming after is actually Mark Brown. So, Game Maker's Toolkit.
That's not making things better.
I've had
that's awesome,
dude. I've had A-listers this last week, and you're officially part of that crew. You're an A-lister game dev. You would have been before Thronefall, but I think Thronefall really sort of it solidified your genius. And that's what I want to talk about this whole episode. I want to talk about the whole approach to Thronefall's development, because I watched you, and we all watched you as you created these devlogs about how exactly you were creating Thronefall, and there was a prototypical strategy behind the whole process, including just creating a ton of games. Your first devlog you did. I'm talking too much, but I'm trying to introduce you here and give everybody some context to what this episode's going to be. I'm fascinated by you because your first devlog for Thronefall was a bunch of games. You did how many games? 20 games or prototypes. You scrapped all of them, which is funny to me. You scrapped all of them, and then you just went with your gut. So with Thronefall, so it almost felt like the prototyping phase wasn't useful. We'll talk about that. And then you did early access, which is kind of a prototyping process as well, because you're interjecting and putting stuff into the game that is the audience and what they kind of want. Maybe we'll talk about that. And then finally you launched your game so you kind of got two launches. And so we'll talk about that. And now the game is doing incredible. How many reviews do you have now on Steam?
15,000 or something.
That's a lot.
Still currently overwhelmingly positive again. So yeah, we're very happy with the result.
Unbelievable.
So just for context as well, we're a 2-man team or 2.5 team, 2.5 person team if you count our community manager. So very, very tiny team. And for our personal standards, Thronefall did incredibly well. And happy to dive into that process with you. Yeah,
let's do it. Okay, so everything I want to talk about is sort of shrouded in the shadow of 2024 being a bad year for game developers. And I'm sure people listening are kind of frustrated with me because it seems like that's all I talk about. But the reason I talk about 2024 being a rough year is because I want 2025 to be a good year for game developers. And so my big strategy with all these podcasts, including with Jonathan Blow and Mark Brown, and also Chris Sikowski, he's one that's coming before you as well. Nice, I'm trying to figure out what the F do we do as indie game developers for 2025? What is the strategy? And you seem to have nailed that strategy as it pertains to prototyping and your process. So my first question for you is, do you feel like the way you approach Thronefall is a good approach for 2025 for game developers? By the way, if you're like me and you always dreamt of making an indie game as a full-time job, I have a free webinar below that goes into exactly how to make 6 figures with just a demo. I was just like you for years. I thought I had to make a game in its entirety before getting a paycheck, but there's actually 3 ways to make 6 figures before even finishing your game. I've done this multiple times, so check it out below if you do want to go full-time indie. And thanks for watching.
I think there is design is a very universal principle, and once you understand how design works, you can just apply the design workflow to whatever you want. Sometimes people ask me, Jonas, why are you so good at everything? Why can you make music? Why can you make graphics? Why can you do everything? And I'm like, because the design process, it's exactly the same everywhere, right? So the way design works is, first of all, you define some design goals. So you have to get a very, very good understanding of what you want to achieve. For a video game, that could, for example, be I want to achieve commercial success on Steam. I want to work on something that I enjoy, and so on and so forth. But when you design something else, if you design a piece of music, then you have entirely different goals, right? Then you're like, this piece of music has to fit into this specific level. It doesn't have to, or it's not supposed to clash with any of the sound effects I have in the level. So first of all, you kind of define the goals and constraints, and then you start a search process. And I've talked about this in one of my videos, but I'll explain it real quick. The search process is essentially you're making the assumption that you cannot guess the best solution to this optimization puzzle that you've been given, right? The goals and constraints are essentially a unique optimization puzzle, and now you have to find the solution, the best solution to this optimization puzzle. And the way you do that is you branch out in a couple of different directions and just experiment and try different things. And over time, as you gather experience, as you go through these optimization processes more and more often, obviously you gather some experience and you get better at making targeted experiments. And in general, like the quality of your experiments improves because you're better at guessing a rough direction. But you can't have the illusion that no matter how good you are, you can't have the illusion that you're just gonna guess the best possible solution first try. That just doesn't happen. So if you wanna arrive at a very good solution, you have to experiment, you have to try things. The problem with that is that it's a very slow process. So eventually you have to start experimenting so much because it's gonna slow you down. But a very good time to experiment is in the beginning because you're kind of narrowing in on the direction. You're trying out all of these things. And then once you have the direction, that is when you go into transition into speed mode and you stop experimenting so much and you basically accelerate and try to make some progress. And you still have to experiment a little bit. Like you shouldn't never entirely stop that because there are a bunch of risks of overshooting or ending up in a space where you don't want to be. But essentially, that's the rough idea. And that design process applies to anything. You can, like, once you decide to understand this design process, you'll instantly become very, very good at almost anything that has remotely to do with design, which is very fun.
So you mentioned at the beginning of that brilliant paragraph there, you mentioned that people wonder, how does Jonas know how to do art and music? And so your point here is that anything as it pertains to games is the way you've approached it is that process right there.
Yes.
Okay.
It's always the same process. Design is always the same process, just applied to different disciplines. So for prototyping games, you just do the exact same thing, right? You define the design goals for your game. In our case, or I would say there are some very typical goals that almost all indie game developers share, which are being commercially successful. And I know you and I, we kind of share an opinion on that aiming for commercial success is not something that you have to look down on, or that's morally questionable. What it means is, even if you remove the monetary incentive, you'd still be making the exact same games. Because what I also want is I want a lot of people to enjoy my games, and that just goes hand in hand with
it does
making something that's commercially successful.
Yep.
And then also I want to work on something that I personally enjoy, and I think, as mentioned, a lot of game developers just share these goals, and that's how I start into this search process. And these design processes, they always have different scales. If you make like a 3-year commercial indie game project, then you scale everything accordingly. So this beginning phase where you try out a bunch of different wild ideas and see what sticks, that also gets scaled up proportionally. So for Thronefall, we did like 2 or 3 months of prototyping. And what you said is that we scrapped all of the prototypes. That's not entirely true. We tried out a lot of different ideas, and in this specific case, it took us a long time to find something that sticks. So we followed a a misguided path for a bit with a card game idea. Then we realized, okay, no, that's not quite it. So we went back to prototyping and narrowed down our search a little bit. We were like, okay, we found a pretty cool fantasy here. We want to make like a medieval strategy game, but simplify it a bit. So we made a bunch of different prototypes about that. There was one that was a little more like Plants vs. Zombies, where all of the enemies are coming from one side. So there were a couple of different ideas, and we're slowly narrowing down our search space there. And eventually, Paul just had a prototype that vibed really well with us, so we locked that in. And from there, the search process doesn't end, it just narrows down. So from there, the next question would be, which art style do we go for? So we start prototyping a bunch of different art styles. Then there are a bunch of gameplay questions that need to be figured out. So we start making a gameplay prototype that very specifically captures what we're trying to go for. Right. And then you just narrow down the search further and further until you have a very good idea of what you want to make. And then you go for it.
Okay.
And
go ahead, sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead, sorry. We have a little bit of a lag here, so it sounds like I'm interrupting you. I promise I'm not.
No worries. Yeah, we're on different sides of the
Well,
world.
let's see if I can fix that. So we've got, I could change my region here. That's.
I don't think that changes much.
I've seen it work. I'm gonna try it here. We're gonna see if it does.
All right.
Okay. Check 1 2 1 2. How are we?
1 2 check.
How are you? Are you good?
Yes.
Oh, see, I fixed it. I switched to Russia, and it's so much better now. So, okay.
Oh, okay. Awesome.
Okay, keep going. Sorry, Jonas.
I think I was pretty much done with that point.
Okay, so the big question I have, and when you started saying all this stuff about the search, it hinges on taste, on the ability to know what's good, on the ability to know that when you have found something, whether it's a game idea or you've written a song or you've found an art style you like, it hinges on taste, the ability to identify something as valuable, right? Is that true?
Yes. The way I describe it in my video is I describe it as a measurement, right? You make an experiment, you branch out, and then you need to make a measurement to see how good that experiment actually was. And I would say with a bit of experience, your own taste, your own estimate becomes a very accurate measurement. That's one of the advantages that experience brings. But there are different ways to measure how good an experiment is. And if you want an accurate measurement, then there are more accurate measuring devices than just your personal taste. For example, one very obvious one would be playtesting, bringing in external playtesters and having them, watching them, seeing what they think. So whenever you make very important gameplay decisions, for example, before you really lock in your final game idea, before like spending 3 years of development, I would make sure to make some of these more accurate measurements with other playtesters so that you get some better data.
Okay.
On that in particular, I want to point out one mistake that I see a lot of people make in this specific phase is because a lot of people hear this advice of, oh, you should prototype your games, right? And what they do is they make one prototype. They show it to their friends, and their friends are like, that's a pretty good game. And then they make the game, and that's completely pointless.
Yep.
Because you don't have any data points to compare it to, right? You don't know how your friends would have reacted to this, how would have friends have reacted to this. Sometimes I hear even stories from bigger AA or AAA companies that do this. They're like, okay, we're building this prototype, and now we're sending it to this playtesting company. And I'm like, okay, which other games did you send to them? And they're like, and that, in my personal opinion, that's pointless. That's completely pointless, because what is the reference point, right? Like, both personal taste as well as feedback from others, there's no objective measurement. There's only relative measurement. So you need reference points to compare these measurements. Otherwise, there's not really any point in making them.
So the point of prototyping for everyone listening right now, because like I went to some seminar when I was like 24. I'm 30. How old am I? I'm 34 right now. So like 10 years ago, I went to some seminar or something, and it was all about prototyping. And I saw it as this sort of side thing. Like, yeah, you can do it if you want. If you're like a baby, or you're immature, or you can't come up with good ideas, then you prototype, right? But if you're a really good game developer, just go for it and follow your gut. So I think some people listening right now who are new to game dev, they might not see the value in prototyping. What's the end result of prototyping? Like, what is the whole point of doing it?
The point of prototyping is that it is easier to choose the best game idea than it is to guess the best game idea.
Oh, that's great. I love that.
That is the entire point, basically, also of this entire search process and so on that I talk about. Think of it like this. You're entering a prompt into an AI model, and it spits out 10 different images. If you just pick the first one, it's gonna be worse than if you have 10 and you pick the best one. Just that in this case, you are the AI model and you're spitting out the ideas. And if you generate 10 ideas and pick the best one, it's gonna be way better than if you just pick the first idea that comes to your mind. It's just gonna be better. Yeah, like, we overestimate our abilities a little bit.
Yep.
Or I would say, even if you are experienced, if you are very experienced and skilled, if you make if you come up with 20 ideas and choose the best one, it's still gonna be better than the first one you had. It's just obvious.
It's so interesting. It's like democratic game development. I mean, and it's not particularly profound, even though I think what you're saying it's new to me and it's profound to me. This is like standard business practices. You only invest money into something that's already making you money, or you invest money into something that has a high probability of making you money, right? You don't launch 100 McDonald's across the country without first knowing that McDonald's makes you money. And I think the same is true with prototyping. It's like you don't invest money and time and effort for years into a game unless it's proven itself to be probable that it will make you money and be successful.
And it's the same with smaller scale design processes as well. For example, let's say you're painting an image, then most people, before they paint the image, they do a drawing. And why do they do the drawing? They want to prove that their composition works, right? And if you scale up that process to something that, instead of taking a couple of hours, takes a couple of years, then it makes sense to scale up this part of the process as well, where you spend a couple of months just dedicated to essentially making the sketch and making sure your composition is right before you paint this giant image that's gonna take you like 3 years to finish. It just makes strategic sense, as you mentioned.
Yep. Well, the way I've always described it as it pertains to game art, and by the way, I totally agree with you that this, what do you call it, this search process is applicable to everything in your life. But for me, it's very applicable to 2D game art. I call it start in the abstract and then solidify later. So for me, when it comes to 2D art, I start with a very generic gradient color palette. And I'm sure, what's is it Paul, your team member's name?
Yes.
I think Paul probably does the same thing. It seems like he's a color theorist at his core. He's really good with color. And that's true for me as well. You start with an abstract color palette, and then you tighten up the screws as you go on. So you sort of have these layers of proof that what you're doing is working. It's kind of like building a house. You start with the foundation first, then you frame it, and then you can make it pretty later. But you need to get the framing done first. So I totally agree with you. When it comes to making games, you need to start in the abstract, prove the abstract, and then tighten the screws later. One final metaphor is IKEA furniture. It tells you do not tighten the screws until you've built the whole thing, right? And so it's very similar to making a game. For Thronefall, and we'll move into early access here. Would you consider early access the part of development where the screws aren't tightened, or should all the screws that are in the project be tightened before you even go early access? Does that make sense?
So that was a lot of questions at once. I'm not entirely sure what to respond to, but let's just.
I want you to respond to every single one from memory. The major question here is early access. The way I perceive early access, and you did early access. The way I perceive it is you're launching something incomplete, and the screws are not tightened, so it's kind of wobbly. There's flaws in it. Is that true, or is it small, tight, and perfect?
All right. Here's the way I think about early access is. Early access is essentially your main launch, right? We've talked about this a little bit on Discord. I know there are different opinions about this. There are some developers that say if you do early access, you essentially get 2 launches. There are other developers who say you only get 1 launch. I personally, despite knowing there are different opinions on this, I land more on the side of things of saying you only get 1 launch. So the first time you launch your game, even if it's early access, look at that like that's your main launch. If your early access launch is not gonna go well, then like the second launch is not gonna go well either. Like I think Chris Zukowski told me this, that like this is even very statistically provable that the first launch is the big one. The second one, if you're lucky, is another little blip, or maybe half, if you're lucky, half of what the initial release was. And this is especially interesting for Thronefall because Thronefall launched with very, very small amount of content. We had like 3 levels when we launched into early access, and it was very, very successful, even at this very tiny scale. And then we spent 1.5 years adding tons and tons and tons and tons of content. And then we went out of early access. And even though there was way, way, way more content now, the second release didn't do as well as the first one. So that's the thing. So the way we looked at early access was more like a scaling device. We were like not sure how much time and resources to invest into Thronefall yet. So we took it like as a very, very accurate measurement, just throwing it out there on Steam, seeing how it does. And then depending on how well it does, either just stop right there. Like if Thronefall would flopped right after early access launch, we would have just been, okay, I guess this game is done now. And because it did so well, we spent more time on it. That was like, it launched in a very polished state as well. Like we treated it like a main release, just with a scaled down version of our game. And then based on that, we made a decision on how to scale from there. Okay.
So your point is the main launch of an early access game, it's solid, it's tight, but it's small. So you can't launch a loose project. And by loose, I mean there's no balance, it's buggy, it's not very clear. That, for example, like that the tutorials aren't clear, the teaching isn't clear. All of that stuff has to be very, very tight, but it can be small, right?
That's exactly right. I think you can get away with a small game in early access. I do not think you can get away with a bad game. Like if you have tons of bugs and problems, and you're just like, I guess let's cash in now and see how it goes. That's a bad idea. That's a very bad idea. Because then what's going to happen is you're going to get a bunch of negative reviews, and then your game's just dead in the water. Nobody's going to buy it anymore. So you need to launch with something that is very, very good, but it can be small. And then you can just scale it up from there. I think that's the way I would go about early access.
Okay, and
if I were to do it again.
Exactly. Okay. Well, that's another question, and we'll get into that if you're going to do it again for 2025. But but really quickly here, what kind of games are good for early access?
First of all, games that you can imagine working on for a long time, because one more way to look at early access is like as a communication tool. Essentially, if your game is in early access, it communicates to the player, we're still actively working on this. So, and it communicates that very efficiently. So that is a great way to use early access if that is something you want to communicate. And then, of course, it only really works with replayable games, because if you have a game that you play once and then you're kind of done with it, it's probably not the best fit for early access, because the likelihood that people come back to it is not that high.
Okay. Do you consider early access prototyping? Is it? No, it's not. So you've chosen a prototype, and do you? Well, the reason I ask that is because it's like, how much do you listen to your audience as they play the game, and as you scale it up and make it bigger after it's already launched on early access? Is it something like a scientific process where you're taking feedback and bringing in new elements and then deleting those elements because they didn't necessarily work?
I think my main takeaway from the early access period of Thronefall is that we should have listened to players more. For example, they always were like, we want an endless mode. And we've always been like, nah, it doesn't really fit into our game, doesn't really fit our design philosophy. We're not sure how to make it work. And now recently I prototyped an endless mode, and I I absolutely loved it. So I'm
so
like,
good.
Why didn't we do that earlier? And there are many cases like that. For example, one friend of mine kept telling me, add a minimap. You should really add a minimap. And we're like, we don't think it's that important. And then once it was in, we immediately agreed, and we're like, how could we live without that, basically? And there are a lot of instances like that where in hindsight you're like, we should have listened to the community a bit earlier.
Okay.
But then there are also a lot of other instances where the community is asking for things that just don't fit into our schedule or that don't have a very good ROI. Like, for example, tiny bug fixes. Or, I mean, obviously we fixed the worst ones, but if there's like, this arrow followed me for a second too long and it destroyed a building over there, then obviously we look at how often does that actually happen, and is it worth fixing that? Because we have, you should have a look at our Miro board. Actually, if you want, I can show you real quick.
Yeah.
No, I have to log in. I'm not sure why.
Miro always throws me out. Yeah.
I'll send you a screenshot if I remember.
Yeah, sure. And I'll put it in the edit.
Yeah.
Well,
it is full of tasks. There are millions of tasks on our Miro board. So there has to be some selection, some arbitrage for what you do and what you don't do. That's just normal.
Yeah.
But for a lot of things, I wish we would have listened more to the community. And I would definitely say the community has very, very actively shaped how Thronefall looks like during early access.
Okay.
Like, their feedback was very valuable, because we got a lot of live feedback for which kind of levels they like, which kind of levels they don't like, and which bosses they like, what was too easy, what was too difficult. So we could make a lot of adjustments there before launching out of early access. And as mentioned, launching out of early access is not like this crazy second release. It's more like it communicates to the players that, okay, the game is done. Because there are a couple of players that don't like purchasing early access games. They're like, I want to purchase this when it's done. So that's just basically the way to reach those kind of players that were like holding out for that moment.
Right. Well, there's a big question that I've had, and I struggle. This goes back to sort of how we, as game developers, how we search and find what's working in our game, whether it's the art, the music, the development, the mechanics. And so I've sort of got 5 little circles here, and they include family and friends. They include a YouTube audience. This is just my little circles. X, my Twitter following. Instagram, my Instagram following. But then there's also Steam. And that's your Steam audience. And that really only can get built with early access. So this is stuff that these are samples that we can listen to help us determine how to grow our game and how to scale it. So my question for you is, who do you listen to? Who should we listen to the most in those circles? Because I think your circles are similar, right? You've got a social following, you've got your YouTube following, and you also have your audience of players who are playing Thronefall. who are the people to listen to? And who should we not listen to as we scale our game?
That's a very interesting question. I have never really thought about it that deeply, but just I think from my gut feeling, I would say the first people I really listen to are other game developers, especially game developers who have successfully released games before. Because players don't always know what they want, right? As I've mentioned before, we should have listened to them maybe a little bit more. But in general, I think if you design a game by just listening to players, it's probably not going to turn out so well. You need your own vision, kind of. You need to be very careful about your search process and design decisions. And I think other game developers, especially the ones who've made it before, have a very good understanding of how that process works, how players react to certain things. So that is very valuable. And then the second on place 2 would just be the players, the people who are actually interested in your game and actually playing the game. As mentioned, in many cases, you should listen to them more than you probably do.
Yeah.
And the tricky thing about listening to players is always that you need to read between the lines a little bit, especially. So essentially what I would say is listen to the problems players have, but don't listen to their solutions, the solutions they suggest.
Oh, I love that. That's brilliant.
So if they say, oh, you should really add a new enemy in this level, I'm like, what's the underlying problem? Maybe the underlying problem is that this level is not interesting enough. And then I can be like, okay, what can I do to most efficiently make this level more interesting? And most of the time, the answer is not what the player came up with as a solution.
Yeah, I mean, this is highly relevant for prototyping because, as you know, and you are one of the game developers I listened to when I was doing beta testing for Twisted Tower. One of the big problems that I had over the summer was this crazy insecurity that boiled up inside of me. Even though this is my third game, I feel like I know how to make solid games. But this crazy insecurity boiled up in me because I had a slew of testers, from game developers all the way to just random people on Twitter who played the game. And I'm getting all these different kinds of feedback. Some of them are good. You had great feedback, but you had some constructive criticism as well. Some people who are giving the game a 5 out of 10 because it's just not their cup of tea. And so what happens is, and this is especially true with prototyping and launching demos in early access games, is you get all this feedback and you feel horrible because so much of it is really kind of insulting and they don't get it, they don't understand it. And so you're stuck in this search process and you're saying, who do I listen to? Like, is this actually good or not? I mean, the ultimate way to determine whether your game is good is money. Like, if you're getting money, that's the ultimate transfer of value, right? But when it comes to, like, for example, posting on Twitter, I'll post. For some reason, I went through this whole process last year of constantly posting stuff on Twitter, and I assumed that if people liked a tweet or it got traction, it meant that screenshot was good, and that was the, for example, art style I needed to move forward with. Would you advise people to avoid doing that as they prototype their games?
Getting too much feedback is very dangerous in an early phase, because in the early development phase, you are trying to form a vision for what you are creating, and first of all, you need to be very, very certain about your design goals. If you're not certain about your design goals, then you're lacking a very important filter to filter feedback by. Like, if you get feedback and it doesn't match your design goals, then at the very least you can be like, okay, that doesn't match what I want to do, and you can filter it out. But if you're lacking the easiest way to get disoriented is to not know what you want to achieve.
Yeah.
And then ideally, you want to build another safety layer above that, which is like narrowing down a little bit, like the vision of your game, coming up with a 2-sentence pitch. Like, Thronefall is a minimalist game about building and defending your kingdom. And once you have this core vision defined, then it also gets much, 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 much easier to filter through feedback, because you can be like, this person wants to control units with their mouse. That does not fit into our core design vision, so we're just not gonna do it. No matter how many people ask for it, we're not gonna do it. And if you don't have like these filters, these basic filters, you get disoriented very, very easily. And another thing, just touching on something else you mentioned, is the pain of receiving feedback. I think I have something that helps with that, like a way to look at it, which is no pain, no gain.
That's right.
Right? Becoming better as a game developer and becoming better at other skills, it also requires you to get better at taking punches. And the way I look at it is, these punches you're receiving, that's where a lot of other people quit. They're just like, okay, I don't want to take this anymore. I'm going to do something else. So if you can withstand that, and if you're like, okay, bring the punches and then continue going anyways, that is what actually builds success in the long term. So whenever I take these punches, I'm kind of a little bit like, yeah, all right, bring it on. If I make it through, then 10 other people didn't, and I'm ahead, right?
Yep.
So that's kind of the way to look at that, I feel like.
Absolutely,
and
dude.
Especially when receiving feedback for your games, a lot of developers like to get very apologetic and be like, look, this section of the game isn't done yet. I don't want feedback for this section of the game.
Yeah.
Or they're like, no, my game is not ready to receive feedback yet. I basically need to polish up everything so that I don't have to hear some feedback from you that I already know about,
Yeah.
And that's just like, who cares, man? Just show your game, just close your mouth, don't say anything, and just take the punches. Just take them.
Enjoy them.
Seriously.
You will enjoy them.
It's like, okay, you know that this section of the game isn't finished. Just let them say,
Yeah. Well, I think the reason
this does look kind of unfinished. Like, who cares? Who cares? Seriously.
Man, I think the reason why game developers struggle so much with taking feedback is because, well, I'll just speak for me. I have a physical response that lasts for months after playtesting. So if somebody playtests my game, I will literally be in pain. Like, I will have stomach pain for a month or two. And so over the summer, when you were testing and everyone else was testing one of the sort of first iterations of the beta test, because we did multiple iterations, I was just the worst father. I was the worst husband, and I was like physically sick for months. And it's so hard. It's so like anytime I think game developers think they're gonna plan on doing a play test, I think they procrastinate it, especially during the early production, because when I first start a game, I'm passionate about it. I'm excited. I have this gut feeling that it's going to be amazing. And so I will avoid playtesting because I don't want all of that confidence to crumble, right? Mm-hmm. How do you avoid that feeling, that confidence collapsing? Or should you avoid it at all? Is it good to have your confidence collapse? Maybe it means your game isn't good.
I'll say again what I said before. I think I've been following your channel for a very long time, and I think you're making some very, very big jumps in your development at the moment. And I think maybe part of that is that you got back some of that humility, some of that curiosity to ask around, see how other developers do it. And I think it's definitely very important to maintain some of that. And that's something the punches help with. So honestly, just expose yourself to those punches, and it helps keep you on the ground a little bit. I think it definitely helps. Well, what was the question?
Well, the question is that there's a difficulty, because when game developers do playtesting, they become insecure, and they lose motivation for their game. So on one hand, you've got developers who they'll take your advice and they'll say, okay, I'm going to take the punches. What if those punches are so severe that they imply that the game should be quit? How do you know when to quit because the punches are so bad and you need to start a new prototype, or you need to keep going? How do you know?
Okay, so you're touching on a very difficult conundrum here, which is I sort of describe it as the conundrum between shiny object syndrome and sunk cost fallacy, which are kind of two different fallacies you can fall into. On the one side of the spectrum, you have sunk cost fallacy, which is I've spent 1 year on this. I have to finish it, no matter what. I've already spent so much time on it. And while it would be the far better decision to just quit and start from scratch. So that's sort of developing a blindness for the fact that you should really start over. Uh-huh. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have the shiny object syndrome, which is the exact opposite, where you're like constantly quitting your projects and are like, no, this project is not the right one. No, this project is not the right one. And you constantly start new things and you also don't get anywhere. And both of these are equally dangerous. And I think the best way to avoid both of them is to have a very structured design process where at the very beginning you already try out multiple ideas. And if at the very beginning you already try out multiple ideas, you kind of avoid the sunk cost fallacy trap a little bit, because the likelihood that you're gonna end up on a good idea, like on a good concept, is way higher. And you're also avoiding shiny object syndrome a little bit because you got more of that stuff out of your system already, right? You're already, I've already tried all of these other ideas and this was the best one, I'm gonna stick with it. So I think a structured design process is really my main answer to that question.
Yeah,
how it relates to feedback you're receiving. Obviously, if you're running your playtests too late, then the punches become very, very painful and potentially devastating. And maybe that's also one of the things you ran into, that you just playtested too late, right? The majority of the game was sort of already in a fairly finished state. And if you start playtesting at this point and you figure out that there are some major flaws, then obviously it hurts a lot.
Exactly.
I can imagine that.
Well, it makes me go back to what you were saying about game developers being the number one sort of resource as to whether your game is good or not. At the end of the day, I think I totally agree with you. At the end of the day, if you're going to build let's say your house on a foundation, I think the strongest foundation to build your house on is game developers. Like, you have your core, sort of almost like it's almost like what do you call them? Like a team of advisors that are helping you run your business. I think that because, like, for example, some games might just do poorly in the beta test. I know David Whaley, the creator of We Harvest Shadows, he told me in his podcast that he got a ton of negative feedback in his alpha testing of the game. Like, people just didn't get it. Had he listened to that and quit the game, that would have been a real shame, because that game is awesome. So what he did was he took that feedback and he's like, okay, I'll take it. But he really truly relied on the feedback of industry leaders, including Jeff Keighley, who featured his game at Gamescom. Point being, I totally agree with you that one way to mitigate quitting the wrong game, or knowing when to quit a game, is exactly. I totally agree with you about proving it first with prototyping, and getting it out of your system. But number two, leaning on solid, proven game developers, so that all the feedback that comes in during alpha testing doesn't distract you and make you quit a project that really you shouldn't. And that's why, for me, during beta testing, there was a little I would reach out to game developers like you and just say, hey, do we put more money into this project, or do we just go ahead and wrap it up? That was one of the best ways to get feedback for me, was to ask people who've made money as game developers, ask them, hey, would you invest more money and more time into this project? You know what I mean? What I mean?
Yeah, I think you still need some like filters to sort it through, because obviously you can, if you ask a lot of game developers, you'll still get contradicting information. Some will say you should make your game cartoony style, others will say keep it as is. there's still, I don't know, there has to be this vision layer, this filter that you just filter everything through this. I don't think there's any way around that.
Yeah.
Like sometimes I try to give advice to teams who are trying to make games, and after the conversation I just feel like I confused them more than I than I helped them, because they're just overwhelmed with all of the feedback they're getting from different people. And the last person told them something different, now I'm telling them something different again, and at that point I'm just like, if you're confused by the feedback you're getting, the number one thing you gotta do is establish those filters.
Sure.
You're gonna end up confused otherwise.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I wrote down and circled like 5 times a big question I have for you. You said, establish your design goals, establish your filters. Can you give me some examples of that?
I think there are multiple layers to these filters. Like the first filter is, as mentioned, your overarching goals of what you want to achieve, making a successful commercial release, working on something you enjoy. So, for example, if somebody suggests something that you don't enjoy working on, then you can use that filter you've established to
Got it.
filter it out. And then you build additional filters on top of that, right? Then the next filter you build is the core vision for your game, like your 2-sentence pitch. For Thronefall, there would be minimalist strategy game about building and defending your kingdom. If anything comes along that doesn't fit that filter, we can just ignore it. And if feedback comes along that fits that filter, then we can be like, oh, you're right, we should do that, as we should have done with some of the feedback that we got from the community.
Yeah.
But ignore it anyway. And so I think maybe a good way to think about it is that in the early phase of your development process, you are trying to build this stack of filters step by step, right? You start very wide and open, prototype a lot of different ideas, and then sort of as you get an idea of what you want to make, and it can be confusing in the beginning. That's just part of the process. There are a lot of ideas out there. You're gonna have tons and tons of options. It's just important that you start narrowing it down. So basically you're narrowing your constraints further and further. And it's important to do this slowly, because if you do it too quickly and you're just like, okay, my constraints are this, then the likelihood is high that you didn't design your constraints correctly, right? Your constraints need to be designed just as carefully as the rest of everything else you design. So I think it's important to just slowly narrow your constraints, and then you can start using that as a filter for feedback.
Man, that's so tough. It's like what you're saying is the framework makes sense, it's practical, but I've found that things like a GDD, things like creating those filters or establishing that 2-sentence pitch, they're definitely easier said than done, primarily because do you agree that game developers discover their game while they make it?
Yes.
Does that make does that make the GDD irrelevant? Does that make the prototyping process irrelevant?
I think the purpose of game design documents is mostly to communicate within big teams. I think game design documents are actually not that useful in small teams. I think as teams get bigger and bigger, you just, for practical reasons, need the game design document to make sure that everybody's on the same page, that you have everything in writing, so that if somebody's like, oh, I thought our constraints were here, then you can point to the design document and say like, no, our constraints are over there. So that is a problem you have when multiple people work on something. But I think in solo project and in tiny teams, kind of not as important. Maybe if it helps you keep your constraints in mind, then I think it could make sense to write it down, put it in writing. Like I can see that helping, especially for example for these filters that you've strongly decided on and are like, we're not gonna throw that overboard. I think it makes sense to write them down. For example, for Thronefall, it really, really helped our prototyping process.
Yeah.
Once we had this 2-sentence pitch,
Mm-hmm.
we put it on our Miro board, and from there on, it got a lot easier because we had clearly defined constraints. The fact that they're written down means they are set into stone. They cannot be changed. I think the danger with just writing a game design document from the hip is that you're locking in too many design decisions too early. So
Yes.
I think I would go about it more gradually and kind of try to do this instead of just if writing a game design document is the first thing you do for your indie game, I would be a little bit concerned. That if anything, that should be a gradual process, like a document that you build over time or something.
Yeah. It's a living, breathing document. It's not like scripture. It's like, no, it's gonna change and morph, and especially with bigger teams, you've got to have team members who are like assigned to the GDD, and they're constantly updating it and changing it and having change logs.
Yeah. I would be maybe I would be a bit more sacred about it and be like, what's written down is written down, and I think it's important. Would be important to not make it part of the culture that the game design document can constantly be changed. I think it would be better to be like very careful about what you put in your design document, but then once it's written down, it's not as easy to get it out of there again, because otherwise you'll end up in one of those loops where you constantly end up changing things and not really going anywhere.
Well, it's whether the question is whether the GDD is it directs what your game is versus it's a resource for the team. And that's the struggle I find, is like sometimes it's a resource and sometimes it's this sort of constitution that keeps your game within a certain frame. Because I found that our team, we would use it as a resource a lot. Like it's like, what's this gun's purpose? What's this gun's visual style? What's this level's theme? And that stuff changed, and so we had to tweak it and change it so that the team could use it as a resource. But I totally agree with you that I will just say there are definitely aspects of the GDD that are foundational that need to stay locked in. For example, the 2-sentence pitch. If the 2-sentence pitch is part of your GDD, which I think it should be right at the top of the GDD. You got the name of the game and the 2-sentence pitch. But I have a question for you about the 2-sentence pitch, which is, why does that matter?
Because it's a filter for everything that comes after it.
Is it? And go ahead.
And there's one more reason that's very important, because it is a way for you to communicate what your game is to the player efficiently. A lot of developers I see, they just make a game, and then once it's done, they figure out, oh, hold on. How do I explain my game to players? And they realize that it can't be. It can't be explained in a 2-sentence pitch. It's a platformer Metroidvania with puzzle elements that also has roguelike and it has skill tree, and there's a story, and then it's too much. So having a 2-sentence pitch early on guarantees you that there is an easy way to describe your game, because not every game can be described easily. But if you want to succeed commercially, it is highly recommended you make a game that can be described easily.
Yes.
Because if you can't even explain your game, there are a lot of things you're going to struggle with. You're also going to struggle with finding publishers, with getting funding from Kickstarter. Like, if you can't even easily explain what you're making, how can you expect anybody to follow along? Everybody's attention spans are so short. Yep. It's not easily explainable. That's a huge disadvantage. So better lock that in early.
Why is efficiency important, though? Like that, I'm trying to dig down into 2025, because we'll get there. But you said 2-sentence pitches are important because it efficiently communicates the idea of the game to an audience. Why is efficiency important? And I'll preface this with some games from the 90s and the 2000s, early 2000s, they weren't efficient in how they communicated things, right? They were inventive. So, like, for example, if I had to pitch Metroid in the 1990s to, let's say, an investor, I'm not so sure that game is a 2-sentence pitch. Star Wars, if I'm going to pitch Star Wars, the intellectual, like the IP of Star Wars, the films, if I'm George Lucas and I'm going to pitch that, I'm not so sure that it's simple in its pitch. So my question to you is, why is it, first, do you agree with that premise that some things that are successful aren't simple? But secondly, why does efficiency matter right now for game developers?
I think efficiency in explaining your game matters a lot because expectation management is kind of the name of the game on Steam. Like, expectation management is extremely, extremely important on Steam for one simple reason. You do want the people who enjoy your game to download it, but you do not want the people who don't enjoy it to download it. So you have to communicate very, very quickly and efficiently who your game is for, what your game is. And if you fail to do so, then the wrong people are going to download your game. They're not going to enjoy it, and they're going to leave a thumbs down. And that hurts your game massively. So what you want to do is you want to have a very precise 2-sentence pitch. And you know that not only helps the customer understand your game better, it also helps yourself to understand your game better. Because if the explanation for what your game is like 3 paragraphs or something, then it's not as easy to keep in mind during development. You know, you're bombarded with lots of different feedback, and you're trying to run it through your 3-paragraph filter, and you know your 3-paragraph filter is just leaky and stuff's coming out, and it's not really as tight as you want it to be. You want a nice, elegant filter that works properly. You don't want a 3-paragraph filter that doesn't really define what you want to do properly and has a things don't get more precise when you add more words. And the other thing is that it doesn't mean that you can't innovate. That is not at all what I wanted to say. You can describe innovative things within 2 sentences. And if you can't, then you need to find a way to, and you need to do it early in the process, because later in the process, if you figure out that you can't do it, it's gonna be too late.
Gotcha. So the 2-sentence pitch is both a developmental advantage and a marketing advantage. So it serves 2 things at once.
Yeah, for sure.
I love what you said. Things don't get more precise with more words. That is so good. And like, you can expand that into everything, into development. Things don't get more precise with more mechanics, with more code, you know, with more art styles, more fonts, more colors. It doesn't get better. It gets worse. It degrades the more you try to. It's almost like putting lipstick on a pig, you know. But for me, when it comes to why efficiency is so important with this 2-sentence pitch, do you think it also has to do with supply? So the more games we have, the more competition we have, therefore the less time we have to make a pitch to the audience. So you got to do it quick.
I think that's a very well-known fact, right? That attention spans are very short, and the way most people browse Steam is they look at your store page for 4 seconds, and then they click on the next game.
That's
so
right.
You really don't have time. It needs to be super obvious what your game is.
Yeah, and that brings me into the final sort of question I have for you today for today's podcast, which is 2025. All of this, like, dude, my notepad is just chocked full of stuff. Like, I love writing. Everything you've said is so good today, and this is all applicable to 2025, which is what. Let's say you have a son, and he's 15 years old. His name is Jonas Jr. And he's like, Dad, I want to do what you did. I want to start my own game studio. What do you tell him in 2025? What's the strategy?
First of all, I would teach him the design process, how to design things. I would try to teach him how to take feedback correctly, to teach him how to take the punches properly and not be discouraged by them. And yeah, then we'll just recommend pretty much what I'm doing. I think this model It's kind of, you're right. It's a difficult industry. It's this very red ocean. There are a lot of games out there. Nobody's saying it's easy, right? It's very, very difficult, very competitive space. And essentially, the way to succeed is to just end up on the top of the food chain. That's sort of, I guess, the way to do it at the moment. And the way to do that is, like, this is something I think I should give my game school some credit for, because that's something they stressed a lot, is the process. The process designs your end result, right? The process is what leads to the end result.
Yeah,
so
I love
you
that.
you cannot only apply your design principles to the end product, you can also apply design principles to your process.
Mm-hmm.
And you constantly need to look at your processes and how you go about things, how you design things. The better your processes, the better your final result is gonna be. So, especially in an industry that is constantly changing, I think it's more important than ever to constantly reevaluate how you make games and your processes, and to adjust them if necessary.
Yeah. Man, I think people listening, it's hard for them. I mean, it's hard for me to hear that too, because, well, first off, it's like, well, I don't want to make a successful game. I just want to make games as a hobby.
Yeah,
and I think that's fine. The problem with that is that eventually I'll speak for me. Eventually it's unsatisfying, because even the funnest game idea gets boring, and you eventually burn out. And so a good motivator is, well, okay, I am done enjoying this game as a developer. Now it's the audience's turn to enjoy this game, aka transfer of value. You give me money, you enjoy the game. And so there's another layer of enjoyment, which is I'm building a business. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm now making money. Streamers are playing my game. The press is covering my game. So that's why I think it's important to try and pursue success financially as a game developer, because it's another layer of joy. Once you get rid of the development joy, because it goes away for everybody, you can move on to the next layer, which is how do we sell this thing,
I think it's okay to have very, very different design goals. For example, I think I have a couple of friends who just do not care about money at all. They're just like, they're like these creative minds. They have a very specific vision for something very specific they want to make, and they're perfectly aware of the fact that there's not a big audience for that at all. And they're just like, I want to make that. And, fair enough, more power to them. It as mentioned, it all comes down to your design goals.
Yeah.
Like this very bottom fundamental layer that you build everything on. If you're aware of your design goals, and your design goals do not include monetary gain, then that's perfectly fine. That shapes everything you build on top. Because if you don't care about money at all, then it opens up a lot of other doors that otherwise you wouldn't have access to. It closes some others maybe. It's just a different process. Yeah. And that's why it's important to be aware of your design goals. But one thing I do agree with that you said is that I think a lot of developers that do not care about the money side of things, they at the very least, most of them care about getting their games played,
Sure.
Watching people play their game, watching people enjoy their game. And that is a very similar goal in the end.
Yeah.
It is.
Well, this is a totally random question for you, and it's mainly for selfish reasons. I just wanted to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, sure.
Is early and often a good marketing strategy anymore? Meaning sharing screenshots of your game, sharing concepts of your game, getting wish lists early, creating a Steam page early, building your brand identity early. Or is it changing?
Wish lists do matter. There's no way around that. Wish lists obviously matter. The way you market and sell a game on Steam is, for the most successful games, Steam will give you 90% of your traffic, if not more. Probably for our games, it was probably more like 99, 95% of all of the traffic you get is directly from Steam. So the only thing you're trying to do with other promotion that you do elsewhere is really just to kickstart the Steam algorithm. And the thing is, I think these algorithms are getting better and better. I don't think there's a way to trick these algorithms into thinking you have a good game when you don't. Like these algorithms, they have access to so much data. They know exactly how long people play your game. They know exactly how long people spend on your store page. They know how many of those people wishlist your game. They essentially have very, very hard evidence for how interested people are in your game. Obviously, they don't always know like the artistic value or how maybe if your game hasn't launched yet, they don't know how fun your game is. But they have very, very hard data on how your game performs compared to other games. And the best way to trick the algorithm into giving you more visibility is to just make a better game that more people are interested in.
Yep.
I don't think there are really any cheats or hacks here. Just make a better game. That I used to say just make a great game. Now I also talked to Chris Zukowski, and now my perspective has shifted a little bit to just make a great game and make the right game, because unfortunately not all genres seem to be created equal. So there are some differences, yeah.
A good game is a right game. Is that what you're saying?
No, that's not exactly what I'm saying, but you could frame it that way. Like, if I say just make great games, if I say that, then it means a lot of things, right? For me, a great game means a game that is also marketable, fun, appealing, replayable. Making a great game entails a lot of qualities.
Yeah.
But one in particular that I kind of glossed over, I think, a bit too much, is you also need to make the right game. The right game just means a game that people are actually interested in. For example, the main example from Chris Zukowski, there is just usually that platformers don't tend to do very well on Steam. They're just A, there are too many of them, and B, players on Steam are actually not that interested in them. So even if you make a really great banger platformer, it's just not gonna do as well as if you had made a different game. So the way to please the Steam algorithm is to make a great game, but also to make the right game that people on Steam actually want to play. And you can be a little bit like, oh, that's chasing trends, or but I want to make something different. And if that's the case, if that's part of your design goals, fair enough.
Yep.
But like if you're optimizing for revenue, then unfortunately it's something you have to think about. Like not all genres do equally well on Steam.
Okay. Would you agree, Jonas, that a good process leads to a good game?
It should. Yeah, it definitely increases your chances.
So in a way, it's like don't try and magically make a good game appear out of nowhere. Instead, it's like, no, here's the process of finding a good game in your brain. You find it as a team, right? Like you did with Paul. It's just this, let's play in the sandbox of process. Let's create our filters and our parameters, and we will dig up, in almost like an archaeological dig, we're going to find the good game. But it's within a process and with parameters in that process.
I think you're totally right. I think the reason why a lot of developers struggle with this is because it's very difficult and unenjoyable to scrap your work. But unfortunately, if you want to perform a proper search process, then you just need to be willing to scrap a lot of your work. And I feel like for a lot of developers, it feels like they're wasting their time, right? If you make 20 different prototypes and only end up using one of them, then it feels a little bit like the other 19 were like a waste of time in a way.
Yeah.
But it's still the correct way to go about it, of course. So you need to find processes that work. You need to design your processes intentionally so that they work in your advantage.
Yep.
And then once you have good processes, then just trust the process, and a good process will usually lead to a good outcome.
Well,
for example, for
for
one of my games, Will You Snail, I'll just admit that I didn't follow my own advice at all. Yep. I came up with a random game idea and I spent 4 years working on it. That was completely stupid. Like it was completely either a lucky accident that it ended up working out, or also partially maybe due to my YouTube channel. I have no clue, but I did not follow good processes for Will You Snail.
Correct. I mean, I didn't either for all 3 of my games, including Twisted Tower, which we're not even done with yet. It's like, well, we're basically done. I just have to wrap up some bugs, but it's like every single game that I've done in my last 15 years of making games was building a rocket without really ever launching a rocket, and you just create the whole thing based on instinct. And all of my games have flown, and they've made me money, and they've made me a full-time salary. But I kind of want to. I'm kind of ready to have a rocket that goes into the atmosphere, and just once it hits the atmosphere, it just floats. And Thronefall's doing that for you, right? It's like you made it out of the atmosphere, and you're now just no gravity, and you're just flying. Right? Is that true with Thronefall? I mean, it'll eventually stop making money, but
yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if it's fair for me to judge that myself, but I would say it sounds pretty fair. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Now, the final question I have for you as we wrap up here: there is no better question to ask someone who has succeeded in game development. There's no better question to ask, in my opinion, than what are you going to do next? Because that helps us all go, wait, okay, where is Jonas's head here? Jonas is clearly a smart guy. Let's follow Jonas. What's he going to do?
Yeah, so I actually have a problem that maybe could be described with survivorship bias. You know, for some reason, I managed to make 3 relatively successful games in a row. So obviously my perspective is just keep doing the same thing. Just keep doing what works.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, I see all of these people who are like, oh, it's getting so difficult and so on. And yeah, it makes me doubt some of my perspectives. And I'm I'm certainly listening very carefully to what's going on in the industry, what other developers are saying. I'm the most important thing I think for me is just I don't want to stop learning. I want to keep learning. And I want to talk to more people. I want to learn new tools, try new engines. Like at the moment, I'm starting up a very big learning phase again, because I'm like, okay, I've made enough games for a while. Let's take a little break. Yeah. But I'm like, okay, what do I do with my time? And I think the best thing I can do at the moment would be to just learn some new things, develop some new skills, so that hopefully, once I start diving into the next game project, I'll be ready for it.
Sure.
I'm not sure if you have that, but it's definitely like this. I don't know how to describe it, but this imposter syndrome. It never truly goes away. You're always like, no matter how many games you release, you're always like, will the next one go well? Or it's never a guarantee.
I definitely feel that, dude. I definitely feel that. I feel, I mean, I haven't made a game as successful as Thronefall. The way that I've always made money from my games is to work with investors and publishers and help, Kickstarter and crowdfunding and all that, to help sort of propel the game while I'm making it. And so my approach is just different than, let's say, your approach. So not only do I feel survivorship bias, but I also feel like my lane is totally different than your lane. And sometimes I just feel very lonely in that lane. And that lane being, I always secure funding before I never self-publish. Granted, I'll probably do that for the next game. But I'm in the same position as you right now, which is we're wrapping up Twisted Tower. My team has finished the game, and so the team is moving on to other projects. And so what am I left with? I'm left with a dream of making 2025 the year where I quietly listen to the industry and learn, just like you're saying. I may start a game completely solo, but I'm probably going to do it privately for a while. But people are probably wondering why all the podcasts I've been posting are constantly talking about what's the plan for 2025.
Yeah.
And the reason why is because I think everybody, including Jonathan Blow, who I just had a podcast with, we're just like, what what is in 2025? Like, what does the game industry look like? Because I feel like it's this phoenix coming out of the ashes, and we don't really know what it's going to look like. And so for me, I do want to spend a lot of time just learning privately, and I'll do devlogs about it. But I think for me, yeah, like 2025 is going to be a year of taking a break after we finish Twisted Tower and just learning, because I'm nervous that I'm going to get old and not keep up with the crazy changes of the industry. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It's just changing so fast. So that's the plan for me.
Yeah, that sounds very reasonable. Just keep learning.
Yeah.
Try your best to stay humble. Yeah. I'm very much looking forward to making my next game. I'll probably make another game with Paul, and currently I'm thinking multiplayer might be an interesting thing to sort of explore and to maybe challenge myself with.
Sure.
But it's still very early times. I'm not entirely sure.
Oh man,
I'm enjoying a little bit of a break from bigger projects.
Yeah, I would do that. I would definitely do that. Yeah, multiplayer's scary. So I would love. I'm sure you'll do amazing. I'm gonna watch you from afar with bated breath, because multiplayer's tough, because you have to build that community, and that community has to show up and play the game. So we'll see, man. I'm excited for you.
Yeah. The pressure's constantly on.
Yep.
Alrighty. Thanks so much for inviting me on the podcast. It was very, very enjoyable. I hope I was able to deliver a couple of useful nuggets to all of you watching there. Thanks very much for watching all the way to the end.
Yeah, I think you did. But okay, link is in the description for Thronefall, and also your YouTube channel. Yeah, dude. Thanks, man. That was great.
Thank you, Wang. Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.
All right, guys, if you thought this was really helpful, just remember, if you want to learn how to make games full-time in 2025, if you want to be an indie game developer from your bedroom, I can teach you what I've done. I've been doing this for 10 years. I've secured deals with Armor Games, Serenity Forge, 3D Realms. I've done 2 Kickstarter campaigns, which basically raised $100,000 each. I know how to get funded with just a demo, and I'm going to teach you how to do it. For Black Friday, you're going to get 50% off full-time game dev. And you're also going to get 2D Art Pro and 3D Art Pro, which are my 2D and 3D art programs. They're going to be completely free. I rarely do a sale like this. This lasts for a short time, and there's only 50 seats available. So please check it out below if you dream of making indie games full-time in 2025. I have 4,000 students worldwide. I think you're going to love it. Take a look below. These seats will sell out. All right, cheers. I love you. Thanks for hanging out. Bye. Cheers. Happy Christmas, Harry.